Mastering EAR, Export Administration Regulations. The Export Administration Regulations secretly control the flow of dual-use items. Where do the Export Administration Regulations, EAR, outline the purpose and scope of their implementation, and what are the specific objectives and boundaries that they aim to establish for the regulation of exports, re-exports, and transfers of dual-use items? The Export Administration Regulations, EAR, outline the purpose and scope of their implementation in Part 730 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 15 CFR 730. The EAR is a set of regulations established by the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, to regulate the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items, which are commodities, software, and technology that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. The purpose of the EAR is to protect national security, promote regional stability, and advance U.S. foreign policy objectives by controlling the flow of dual-use items that could contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, support terrorist activities, or otherwise threaten U.S. national security interests. The EAR aims to achieve this purpose by establishing a system of licenses, licensing policies, and administrative processes that ensure the responsible and controlled export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items. The scope of the EAR is broad and encompasses a wide range of activities, including the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items from the United States, as well as the re-export of dual-use items from foreign countries. The EAR applies to all individuals and entities subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, including U.S. persons, foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies, and foreign entities that use U.S. origin items or technology. The specific objectives of the EAR are two. 1. Prevent the diversion of dual-use items to military end uses or to end users of concern, such as those subject to arms embargoes or sanctions. 2. Restrict the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items that could contribute to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. 3. Promote transparency and accountability in the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items by requiring exporters, re-exporters, and transferors to obtain licenses and comply with reporting requirements. 4. Ensure that the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items are consistent with U.S. foreign policy objectives and do not undermine regional stability or exacerbate tensions between countries. 5. Encourage the development and use of dual-use items for peaceful and civilian purposes, while preventing their diversion to military or malicious end uses. The boundaries established by the EAR for the regulation of exports, re-exports, and transfers of dual-use items are as follows. 1. The EAR applies to all dual-use items, including commodities, software, and technology, that are listed on the Commerce Control List, CCL. 2. The EAR establishes a system of license exceptions, which are authorization for exports, re-exports, and transfers of dual-use items without a license, provided certain conditions are met. 3. The EAR requires exporters, re-exporters, and transferors to obtain a license from BIS prior to the export, re-export, or transfer of dual-use items that are not eligible for a license exception. 4. The EAR imposes certain requirements on exporters, re-exporters, and transferors, including the need to classify items under the CCL, obtain licenses, report transactions, and maintain records. 5. The EAR provides for penalties, including fines and imprisonment, for violations of the regulations, including unauthorized exports, re-exports, and transfers of dual-use items. In summary, the EAR outlines the purpose and scope of its implementation in Part 730 of the Code of Federal Regulations, aiming to regulate the export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items to promote national security, regional stability, and U.S. foreign policy objectives. The specific objectives of the EAR are to prevent diversion, restrict proliferation, promote transparency, ensure consistency with foreign policy, and encourage peaceful use, while establishing clear boundaries for the regulation of exports, re-exports, and transfers of dual-use items. The Export Administration Regulations, EAR, a complex set of guidelines that can make even the most seasoned export professionals head spin. But, as I always say, quality is a journey, not a destination. And, in this case, that journey involves a deep understanding of the EAR's purpose, scope, and objectives. Let me take you back to a particular experience I had with a company that was struggling to comply with the EAR. They were a small manufacturer of dual-use goods, and their lack of understanding of the regulations was putting them at risk of non-compliance. Their exports were being held up at customs, and their customers were losing patience. As I worked with the company, I realized that the root of the problem was not a lack of knowledge, but rather a lack of understanding of the why behind the EAR. They saw the regulations as a necessary evil, a burden to be borne in order to do business internationally. But I knew that if I could help them understand the reasoning behind the regulations, they would be more motivated to comply. I started by explaining the historical context of the EAR. I told them about the Cold War era, when the United States government realized that certain exports could potentially harm national security or compromise human rights. I explained how the EAR were implemented to prevent the diversion of dual-use goods to countries or entities that could use them for malicious purposes. As we delved deeper into the regulations, I emphasized the importance of understanding the specific objectives and boundaries outlined in the EAR. I used practical examples to illustrate how the regulations aimed to establish a level playing field for U.S. exporters, while also protecting national security and promoting human rights. For instance, I explained how the EAR's country group list categorizes countries based on their export control policies and practices. I showed them how this list helps exporters determine the level of control required for their dual-use items. I also walked them through the process of determining the Export Control Classification Number, ECCN, for their products, which is crucial for understanding the specific licensing requirements. Throughout our discussions, I sensed a shift in their mindset. They began to see the EAR not just as a set of rules to be followed, but as a framework that was designed to protect and promote the interests of all stakeholders involved. They started to ask questions, to probe deeper into the regulations, and to think critically about their own export practices. One particular conversation stood out in my mind. We were discussing the concept of de minimis levels, which refers to the percentage of U.S. origin content in a foreign-made item that triggers the need for an EAR license. One of the employees asked, "But why can't we just ignore the de minimis level and obtain a license for every shipment?" I smiled and replied, "If you do that, you'll not only be wasting time and resources, but you'll also be creating unnecessary uncertainty for your customers and suppliers." That's when it clicked for them. They realized that compliance with the EAR wasn't just about following the rules. It was about creating a culture of operational excellence that prioritized transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. They started to see that by understanding the why behind the regulations, they could optimize their export processes, reduce costs, and improve customer satisfaction. As we wrapped up our work together, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. The company was on the path to becoming an EAR-compliant organization, not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. They had developed an intrinsic motivation to comply, driven by a deep understanding of the regulations and their purpose. And that, my friends, is the key to sustaining operational excellence in the face of complex regulations like the EAR. It's not about checking boxes or following procedures. It's about cultivating a culture that values transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. As I always say, it's not about being the best, it's about being better than you were yesterday.